On the bottom. Okay. Now we're starting Mem Vav Amid Beis, the very bottom line. Still continuing with the discussion of whether money can be used for chalipin or can be an object of chalipin. That's been the constant discussion, and we've not had any breakthroughs other than to say that the Gemara had a lot of different svaras as to whether it should be, and then we found reasons to say that can't be a proof. So the force here is let's find a way, and the Gemara says, sorry, but your theory doesn't work. So now the Gemara is going to continue in a little bit of a different vein, but keep that in mind, because that'll be the underlying question of whether or not money can be used for chalipin. So even though the Gemara now is going to go off a little bit, but that's still the tangent. That's still what we have in mind, and we'll come back to that. So says the Gemara on the very bottom line, Omer Rabba Omer Rav Huna. Rabba says in the name of Rav Huna, Mecharli be'elu kana. Different scenario. I have money in my hand, and I haven't even counted it. I have a lot of money in my hand. You have a donkey. Say, Richard, you have a donkey, and I'm going to buy your donkey for this amount of money. It doesn't say what it is, because it's a fistful of money. Says the Gemara, Machali be'elu, sell it to me for this that's in my hand. Kana, says Rashi, Machali be'elu, second to the bottom line, Achas b'yodo mos, he's holding money, v'omer l'chavero, Machali chefet shelcha, be'elu shebiyodi, sell me what you have for what money I have. V'lo hikbid lishol kamahem, and he wasn't makbid. The fellow didn't say, how much is in your hand? The owner of the donkey didn't say to him, how much do you have? The kibla miyad halokeach, and he took the money from the lokeach. He just took it. That's the scenario. Says the Gemara, Kana, Rashi, lokeach hachefetz b'moz halolu, vein echad mehem yochel lachzor. So this is very interesting, because it tells us several things. First of all, it tells us that in a sort of nebulous arena where there is no specific amount of money attached to the purchase, you can still make a purchase, and you can't retract. Nobody knows anything. No one knows how much money was really in his hand. You can't retract. And most importantly, once he gives him the money, the kinyan happens even if he didn't move the animal. Now, what have we been saying all along? We've been saying all along that if you make a transaction for money, the money cannot be the stimulus for the completion of the deal. It's the chayfetz. It's the object that has to be transferred with a kinyan. I can't give you money. You take the money. I haven't taken the donkey, and yet the deal is done. That flies in the face of everything we've said. So now the Gemara is telling us, you know what? In this particular case, the money does act as the stimulus for the kinyan, and it's a done deal, and no one can retract. So that's really saying a lot in this sort of half a line. Now,
how do you know it's not counterfeit money?
He doesn't know anything. You're right, Jay. He says, the money that you have in your hand will make the kinyan. Now, wait a second. Here's the caveat that might answer your question. Top of the line on Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. What does the Gemara say? V'yesh alav oinoah. Wait a minute. It's a done deal. Remember what oinoah is. We said the halacha of oinoah is that if you and I make a transaction, Jay, and the price is more than a sixth off of what it should be, more than a sixth, up or down, you got to pay me that sixth. That sixth isn't forgiven. You have to pay it to me. Why? Because that's considered a transaction that it's not fair. Let's just say it's not a fair transaction. So wait a minute. The Gemara is telling us that the deal is done. It's a done deal, but oinoah still applies. Says Rashi on the very top of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, v'yesh lechaver alav din oinoah im ein b'maos kedei demei achefetz shepaschu shtus. If the amount of money that is in his hand is less than a sixth, in other words, it falls below the 1/6 marker, You got to pay it. Now, of course, Jay, if it's counterfeit money, he's got to pay the whole thing. If he says, oh, wait a minute, you gave me monopoly money. Oh, sorry. Yes, I got to pay you the value. Now we have to go and value it, and I have to pay you the value.
But the Kenyan still goes.
The Kenyan still goes. Isn't that amazing? The Kenyan is the Kenyan.
So unusual.
This is post-Kenyan. This is post-Kenyan.
Yes, it's so unusual not to have safeguards built in automatically that says, look, this has to be a real money in order to be a real trend.
So the Gemara, well, the Gemara is making a couple of assumptions, and you're right. The Gemara is making an assumption that this is a fair transaction. People aren't going to cheat each other. If they're off by a sixth, okay, we'll adjust that. That's not the end of the world, but no one is going to cheat anybody and give him paper money when it's not real money.
So how is the actual value of the item determined?
Say it again.
How is the actual value of the item determined? If 1/6 is the
fair market value, you go out and you fair market value. Either you ask a seicher, or you get an appraisal. Again, we're not talking about heavy duty.
I mean, maybe they had like a Kelly Blue Book for animals. A 2-year-old donkey this tall is
Right. I mean, you figure it out either by getting an appraisal or by getting anecdotal evidence from a couple of sellers. I mean, you find out the number and you say, wait a minute, this number is too far off from what I agreed to, even though I didn't agree to a specific number. Still, you owe me the 1/6. But
so what happens in Kedushin? Somebody Makadish somebody with the pruta, it's not worth a pruta. And it's still
Jay, that's why you have Adam. You have Adam under the chuppah who have to two Adam have to say it's worth a shava pruta. I mean, that's why we have that whole exercise of Adam, so they can actually look at it and say, yes, in our opinion, it's a shava pruta. Right, that's exactly what we have. But
if they're off by more than a 6, is that considered actual Geneva? Or is it something
no, it's considered. The Gemara uses the term ona'ah. Ona'ah means it's like a fraud. Okay, it's a loosely termed fraud. It may be unintentional, maybe totally unintentional. He didn't intend. He just had a fistful of money and said, "This is what I'm going to pay." Now, if it turns out that his fistful of money was not enough. Now, it's interesting that Rashi does not flip and say both up and down. Look what Rashi says. If it's below the value of the chayfetz, shepaschu shtus. What happens if he gave him more than a shtus, which halachically he can reclaim? Gemara doesn't say he can do it. Rashi does not say that if I paid you more than a sixth of the value, that I can come back to you and say, I overpaid. Here, Rashi is specifically saying only, I mean, shtus works both ways, by the way. It is an up or a down. Rashi, however, only points out the down, not the up. So there's a lot of mefarshim who discuss this, and among the Rishonim, whether or not Rashi is specifically saying down, and he means up, or whether he means only whether it's down. That's a machlekes. It's not clear whether on the upside this closed transaction he can say, oh, I paid you too much, you need to give me back some money, because he was the one who initiated and said, what's in my hand, right? He said, whatever's in my hand, that's what you're
right. I'm listening to, I'm catching a shiur. I'm trying to catch a little bit of a shiur that starts at 10. Let me get my shoes.
Here we go.
Okay, so now we have.
So let me posit an idea here.
Yeah.
If somebody in this sort of vague on the spot grabs your pile of coins and hands it over and says, "Oh, because I need that donkey right now. So here, this looks like a right value. Here you go." Fine. If one way to look at it, and this would support the idea that if it's too low, then the seller could come back to collect the difference to get it to within a sixth, whereas it's too high, it might be a done deal.
Right.
Would be to say that if somebody overpays for something, that's kind of on them. If they underpay, then in a sense, that first amount could be considered not a payment in full that's not the right amount and always stealing, but rather a down payment in a sense. You've now you paid me half of what the donkey's worth. Here, take the donkey. Oh, oops, you still owe me the other half. as opposed to an overpayment is sort of a different scenario. You've paid for the donkey. Maybe this extra money shouldn't be there, but the payment's done.
Although, but the halacha itself, the pure halacha of Eino goes both ways. I hear what you're saying.
In general, but I'm
halacha
saying
goes
maybe in a
both ways.
case
The
here
halacha
where he
is-
grabs his coins and
If
he
I
thinks
made a
he's
mistake,
grabbing.
yeah, if I made a mistake and paid you too much, then I shouldn't be penalized for being overzealous and saying, "Oh, I need this donkey and I'll pay whatever I have."
Right.
If it is, but here you're right. In this particular case, he sort of controls it more than the buyer does. So
it's on him to be responsible, and
he could have taken off a couple bills and said, "I'll give you this."
Right.
But he didn't know. Let's just say that in the marketplace, neither knows what it's really worth.
Right.
But I need this donkey so badly that I'm giving you whatever's in my hand.
Right. And I'll throw in one other example going back to what we've studied a month ago, 2 months ago, etc., which is he grabs a bunch of coins. He thinks he's grabbing all silver, which is the middle. And so if he accidentally grabbed a mix of silver and copper, he's going to be under. If he accidentally grabs a mix of silver and gold, he's going to be over.
That'd be over. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Again, so the Gemara is trying to cover the basis and saying, you know what, this transaction, and again, we're going to see why this scenario is important, because in every other scenario, we're talking about a specific amount of money. In other words, $100 or even if they're trading animal for animal, whatever it is. This is the first scenario that we've come across where the purchase seems to be somewhat random. In other words, he's buying it for an undetermined amount of money. We haven't seen that before. So the Gemara is coming to tell us, you know what, even that is a good transaction. It hasn't been specified. Neither the buyer nor the seller said it's worth 100, pay me 100, or whatever the case. But just randomly, if he takes out money and the buyer agrees to the fistful of money, I want to tell you that's a good transaction. But the caveat is that we're going to protect the buyer. If the buyer was overzealous in wanting the animal at any cost, that the laws of Ono still play. Even it's unintentional. No one's saying he intentionally wanted to cheat him, but the laws of Ono are meant for the unintentional. In a situation where two people transact and the transaction isn't quite the same, the Gemara says that the halacha imposes something that the parties never discussed, overpayment, underpayment, and the halacha plays. All we're saying here is it seems from the Rishonim and from what Rashi says that this particular scenario, we're more concerned with the underpayment than with an overpayment. If the seller, if the fellow with the money had too much money in his hand, yeah, okay, fine. We're not going to protect you. But it's the owner of the donkey who is selling, who's going to get the money, who will have the advantage of an ono. So now look at the lashon of the Gemara. So the Gemara says v'yesh lo ono. So says the Gemara, and this is what was raised. Jay, I think kana afal gavdalo moshach. Even though the fellow didn't make a meshicha on the what? On the chamar, all he did was pay the money to the other fellow. Kiven deloy kopid kana. Since he was not makbid, he is kana. Why? Here's the key. The chi chalipin dummy, because this is akin to a chalipin chain, a transaction. So in other words, v'yeshal of ono, but even in chalipin we have ono. Why do we have ono? So this is the anomaly. Why do we have ono even though he just made a generic, he just said, I'll take it. Here's the key, the mocha li be'elu ka'amar, because the words that he used, he said to the fellow, sell it to me. So now we have a dichotomy. The Gemara says that this is a chalipin situation. It's not a purchase situation, which, by the way, now explains why when he gave him the money, the deal was done, even though the fellow didn't make the meshicha. Because normally in a sale, it's the meshicha that makes the deal, not the transfer of money. But if we're saying this is chalipin, then the chalipin, the money, once it's exchanged, in a chalipin, the first transfer seals the deal. The second fellow doesn't have to. What's the first part of it? Money. So we see that money can make chalipin. Back to our underlying question, can you use money for chalipin? Here we seem to have an example, but you can use money for chalipin because the only thing that transferred hands was the money, not the animal. And we're saying that the deal is done. And the Gemara is saying, Dechi chalipin dami, because this is akin to a chalipin. So we see you can do chalipin bedamin. But, says the Gemara, so why oinah? And that's a good question. If the deal is done, why should there be oinah here? Answers the Gemara right away, Demochali be'elu kama. Even though he didn't express a price, he said it to me, sell it to me. So we have an anomaly of sort of a real dichotomy here. You have a deal that's done by chalipin, but there is a trailer of mechira, not enough to make it a sale. It's still chalipin, but enough to say that the trigger word of machar triggers oinah. So that's a chiddush here. In other words, you can have oinah in a chalipin if you use the word machar, sell it to me. That's the chiddush of the Gemara. All right. So okay. Says Rashi, b'chalipin dami lekame parech. Hey, wait a minute. The Gemara asks, "V'ho ein matbei nasa chalipin." This was the very question. We've been saying ein matbei nasa chalipin, and you're telling me this is chalipin with what? With money. How can that be? We've been saying ein matbei nasa chalipin. So we're going to answer that question later. But right now, it seems to be that we have a proof that you can use money for chalipin because only the money was exchanged, not the kinyan. There was no kinyan Mashiach, says the Gemara. He didn't move the animal. And we say it's a deal. That can only be if money can be used for chalipin. Otherwise, how does that happen? Right? So the Gemara says, why is there a no? Says Rashi, Demachali kama loshen memker v'lo loshen chalipin. So this is really the anomaly in this situation because he didn't use the word chalipin, he used the word machar, sell. So the word machar triggers the oinah, but it doesn't trigger a sale. It doesn't trigger a sale. It's still chalipin, but the machar triggers oinah. That's how the Gemara interprets this particular situation. Now, let's right away say that there is a different version of this Gemara. Rav Ava Amar Rav Huna. So that was Rabba Amar Rav Huna. Comes Rav Abba Amar Rav Huna, and he says, Mochali be'elu, kana ve'ein lo alav oinah. So he argues on this point and said you cannot bifurcate it. You can't say it's chalipin, but for purposes of oinah, it's money. So he comes along and he says, ve'ein alav oinah. In the same situation that we just said, there is no oinah. So this is a machlokes of Amaroim. How do you learn in Rav Huna? Whether Rav Huna means to say that it is oinah or not oinah. Rabbah says there is oinah because of the trigger word mocharli, and Rav Abba says there can't be oinah because it is chalipin. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have chalipin and a mechira. You can't. So Rashi says, okay, fine. So that's the machlokes. And now, at least for now, we're going to conclude that money can be used for chalipin because in this particular case, if only money trades hands and no kinyan, we're saying that it's a final deal. Forget about the oinah portion. It's a final deal, and the deal was struck. Okay. Now we're going to worry about the kashas later, but that's seemingly a proof that money can be used for chalipin. Okay. Says the Gemara. Pshita, I understand clearly. It's simple. Domin ve'ein makbid aleim. That if there's money involved, but there's no makbid. He didn't say, oh, I need $100 for this animal. He said, I'll take what you have. So I understand in that scenario how coming in the chalipin dummy. So I understand that it's chalipin and it's good enough. However, says the Gemara, what about chalipin makbid aleim? This is a new kasha. What about if I do chalipin and I say generically I'll take the money, but makbid aleim, I'm makbid on the amount of money. I said it in terms, but I'm makbid that I am a particular that I want a certain amount of money. So how do we handle that? In other words, is there a different halacha here? Are we going to say that the chalipin isn't chal because he was makbid on the amount of money? So that's the Gemara's kasha. If you say just chalipin and there's no, you don't care, whatever it is, fine, it's chalipin because there was no monetary money that was specifically said. But what happens if he's makbid? So says Rashi, if one exchanged a chayfetz for a chayfetz in chalipin, liknos kedin kinyan, shekonim besuda, v'zeh makbid liro she'asuda shaver kol kach. So he didn't enunciate it in so many words, but he is makbid. He's saying, okay, what's the value of the sudar? In other words, you've got to approximate the sudar. And by the way, when we mean sudar here, we're talking about a sudar, but we don't necessarily mean sudar. Why? Because in a kinyan sudar, you're making the kinyan with the handkerchief, which more than likely is not equal to the value of the chalipin. If I give you an animal for sudar, probably that sudar is not the same as the animal. So when Rashi says here sudar, he's not saying only sudar. He means in a kinyan chalipin, where the sudar is the exchange item, then if a person is makbid and he wants the sudar, or whatever the exchange item is, let's say it's a donkey for an ox or a donkey for, I don't know, a candelabra, whatever, that he wants an approximate equal value. He's not looking to sort of give it away. So that's how we have to understand Rashi, that he says sudar, but he doesn't necessarily mean sudar, because he says they're makmid liro shia sudar shavel kol kach, and what's the likelihood that a sudar is going to be worth as much as a cow or donkey? If it is, great, but if not, then we have to exchange the word sudar for an item of exchange. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Chalipin or makbid aleim. If a person does chalipin and he is makbid that he wants approximate, equality, what's the halacha? What do we do? So that's the question the Gemara is posing now, and the Gemara says, Omar of Ada Ba'ava. So comes Rav Ada Ba'ava, and he's going to give us an explanation of what it means if chalipin or makbid aleim, because we know that if typically a chalipin is an exchange, and people say, fine, I'll take this for that, but nowhere have we said in the past that the person said, wait a minute, what are you giving me? Okay, you give me an ox or a donkey. Is a ox really worth the same as a donkey? I don't know. Maybe an ox is worth a lot more than a donkey, but I'll take your ox for a donkey. But if a person is going to make that exchange and is going to want something particular, then maybe a kinyan chalipin of an ox and a donkey is not sufficient, because maybe one is worth more than the other. So so that's the generic question, okay, in any chalipin. So now the Gemara gives an answer and says as follows: Toshma. Come and listen to the following situation. Harishot, Harishahaya Teifis Paroso Va'omed. A person came into the marketplace leading a para, a cow, by the muzzle, by the straps. Ubochavero, and the friend comes into the marketplace, into the shuk. Va'omalo parascha lama. What are you bringing your cow here for? What do you want? What's going on? So he answers him, Lachamor ani tzorich. I need a chamor. In other words, he says, here, I have a cow, I need a chamor. So he's articulating what he needs. Says the other fellow, Yesh li chamor. I happen to have a chamor. Okay? Sha'ani noselach, and I'm going to give it to you. We're going to trade. Okay? It sounds like a pretty classic case of chalipin. Now, what happens after that? Says the fellow, Paroscha bekama. How much is your cow worth? This is a new twist on the story, because we haven't seen this before. So he says to him, how much is your cow worth? He says, bekach v'kach. So much and so much. Okay, let's say $100. He says, bekach v'kach. So he asks him back, chamorcha bekama. How much is your chamor? He says bekach bekach. So the bekach bekach, we're assuming he means 100. Okay, so now we have 100 and 100. Let's just say in this example, Moshach Bal HaChamor is Hapara. The Bal HaChamor, who is going to give him the Chamor, makes a Meshicha on the Para. V'lo hispik Bal HaPara limshach es HaChamor. But, so now, wait a minute. In a Chalipin, what's the halacha? The first Meshicha, the first Kinyan, seals the deal. The second person in a Chalipin does not have to make a Kinyan. The first one makes it, the deal is done. So what does he do? Before he has it, the second guy, before he has a chance to make a Mashiach on the Chamor, so Mesa Chamor, the Chamor just dies. So they're standing in the marketplace, they're going to make a trade, they asked each other how much is worth, presumably they gave each other an answer that is acceptable. The first fellow makes a Mashiach on the Para, the second fellow doesn't even make a Mashiach and the Chamor drops dead. Is there a deal or not? What do you think?
But there's an earlier question. When they start the discussion, they didn't specify a trade. They were asking the market value, which could imply a sale, not a leaping.
Could imply a sale.
Someone starts talking, and it depends on the sequence of the dialogue between the two.
So you're right, Jay. All we have here is the introduction of money into a deal that otherwise looks perfectly like Chalipin. So now, isn't this the question we want to ask? In other words, when you make Chalipin and you're makbid, you're particular, because you asked how much is it worth, normally you don't ask. You want a Chamor, I want a Shor, let's trade, good deal.
You're Chalipin, yeah.
Right, Chalipin. But all of a sudden you asked how much, and the fella asked you back how much. No one reneged. No one said, oh, wait a minute, it's too expensive, or it's more money, or whatever. They just asked each other. Then the transaction went forward. So now you're right. You can ask the question, is this Chalipin or not? Because the trade was made without money. They only asked about money, but they didn't say, here's 100, give me 100. They didn't introduce money into the actual transaction, only into the question. So now the kasha is this hakpada? Sorry, I gotta get back. So the question is this hakpada? Is anybody makbid here as a result of the fact that they talked about money? So that's what the Gemara asks the question, is there hakpada? Okay, hold on, let me just get my video back here a second.
It's certainly transferring.
Okay. So right. So Jay, you asked the right question. What's going on here? So now, the Gemara tells us, Lokana balachamor sapara, the Bal HaChamor, who made the first Meshicha, is not kinda the para. But wait a minute, it's Chalipin. He made a Meshicha, that's enough. And for the Gemara, Shemamino, Chalipin u'makbid aleim lo kana. So the kasha was, remember, but the Gemara just asked the kasha, Chalipin u'makbid aleim. If you make a Chalipin and you're makbid, what's the din? So we just got an answer. What's the din? The din is lo kana. So what we're trying to say here is that the minute you introduce money into the deal, it sounds like what? I'm selling you a chamor, and you're selling me a para. In other words, the introduction of the money aspect, bekach v'kach, says the Gemara, supersedes the Chalipin aspect of the deal. It's not a Chalipin, it's a purchase. And what's the din in a purchase? If I pay you money and take the animal, the deal is not complete until you make the Mashicha. And since the animal died before you made the Mashicha, no deal. So you understand how we're looking at this? The mere fact, according to this Toshima, according to this Brisa, if you ask about money, you change the scenario from Chalipin to purchase. That's how much asking about money makes a change in the deal. Go
So
ahead.
the words really matter here.
Words really matter. That's what because the Gemara asked that question: do words matter? It's a chalipin. Everybody sees it's a chalipin. Was there money transacted here? No. There was no money. No one took $100 out of their pocket. No one saw money. It was simply a cow for a chamor. But since he said how much, the saying alone tells us the Gemara that it changes the scenario from chalipin to purchase. Amazing. Amazing.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
So it could be interpreted that the asking was to say, well, if there's a difference, there's a dichotomy between the values, that you might want to add money into the exchange.
Right.
At that point, it becomes a sale. Regardless, correct?
Right.
I don't know.
Say it again. And regardless what, say again.
At that point, it becomes a sale regardless, because once you add money to equate the value, it's a sale. Is that what this
That's
is?
what this Gemara is telling us.
No,
Correct.
but I thought we were just saying kafa kafa was the same amount. No, it's only if it's different. I'm
Well,
confused.
it almost doesn't matter. It was the Gemara says.
Well, but what Michael was just saying is that it did matter.
No, no. When you introduce this Gemara, the chiddush is that when you introduce money, and again, the Gemara intentionally said kach v'kach. It didn't say meyazuz and meyazuz. It said kach v'kach and kach v'kach. We can assume it's the same, but it doesn't have to be. That's what the Gemara is telling
but
No,
us.
no,
Rabbi,
I think that
that's-
no, that's the point. I think if
That's the point,
if it's
yeah.
not the same, then this for sure makes sense that this is now going to turn it into a sale and a sale. But if it is the same, then that's really the chiddush to say this now turns into a sale, because before we had last week, the week before, we had a thing where it seemed to be, if I remember correctly, which I might not, the opposite, that it started out as a sale and then turned into chalipin.
Right. But again,
So,
yeah.
so if I just want to know, this is where I'm struggling. Where if I just want to know what the value of that donkey is versus the value of my donkey, and obviously it's not by an independent party, it's between the two, and they're saying it's this much. There's no transaction has occurred. It's a question. And even if they were identical, there is no representation here that a chalifin has taken place, because
Correct.
so it's just an inquiry. So at that point, you don't know whether it is chalifin or a purchase. So, it's to ask that question. It doesn't say anything about anything happening to complete the transaction. It's just asking about what's going on. How do you impute from that language that a transaction has occurred?
Something has to happen. Otherwise, you're just having a discussion.
Right. Nothing's happened. That's why it's not anything.
Well, so okay. I hear your question, but now think.
support Michael's question.
No, all the questions come to the same point, and the point here is that once a person raises money in a transaction, that means he's makbid. Otherwise, he wouldn't say anything about money.
But not so, Rabbi.
Let me just give
Yeah.
you the
Okay.
point.
Go ahead.
If I transfer a cow for a chamor or any two objects, money is never mentioned. Clearly, we are talking about chalipin. We want to make a trade. My animal for your animal, my object for your object, my object for your animal, no matter what.
But it can still be chalipin, because if there's a dichotomy, you can say, well, I'll add this on and we'll complete the exchange with another item with the chamor for the poor.
Hold on. So what you're touching on, I think you're wanting to say, you have to wait a minute for the Gemara to give us a conclusion in a minute. So what you just said is something the Gemara discusses in a context, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, let me just back up. I'm going to make a general statement. Two people want to make a trade and a transaction of an item, whatever the item is for an item. That's a classic case of chalipin, and we say that my item for your item, the first person who makes the kinyan triggers the deal. The second person doesn't even have to make a kinyan. The deal is done. That's the classic case of chalipin. the Gemara came back and asked us a question. They said, we understand in a classic case of chalipin how it works. What about chalipin where the word money is introduced? We haven't had that before. Nowhere have we had a situation where anybody talked about money when we're talking about chalipin. So then the Gemara makes the following statement. If a person asks about money, it means that he's makbid, he's particular, that the valuation should be part of the deal. That's why he asked about money. He wouldn't have asked about money if all he wanted is an ox for a parah. Says the Gemara. And that's why it asked the question, Chalipin or makbid aleim. How do we know he's makbid? Because he asked. He said, how much is it worth? That statement, how much is it worth, says the Gemara, triggers something beyond chalipin. What does it trigger? It triggers that now, even though money was never taken out of anybody's pocket, and if somebody observed the transaction, he never saw money in the picture. All he saw was a chamor for a shore. But the two parties talked about money, says the Gemara, that means that they were makbid. Others, they would not have asked about money. That's just a statement of the Gemara. Gemara says, if you ask about money, that means you're concerned that the valuation should be approximately the same. Now, having said that, says the Gemara, now that means it's not chalipin anymore. It's no longer an ox for a cow for a chamor. It's the values. And if the values aren't the same, then someone has to come up with some money, and in which case it's no longer chalipin, which is why the Gemara concludes that in the case where they asked about money and one person made a mashicha and the second person didn't, and the cow dies or the animal dies, that's not chalipin anymore. That's a transaction where I bought your cow for money and you bought my chamor for money. But remember last week we talked about milsa de lo shchicha, where we talked about money, but money didn't trade hands, but we consider it a sale because there was quote unquote money behind the scenes. So we said that's a milsa de lo shchicha, if you remember, and again, and that's under milsa de lo shchicha, money can play a role in a transaction. However, where in this particular case they asked about money and then they made it a pure animal for animal transaction, the Shema Mino, the Chiddush and the Gemara is that that's not chalipin. It's not chalipin. It's money, and therefore, just give. Even though you gave him the chamor, it's as if you gave him money, and money cannot make a kinyan for the other person. That's why when he took the chamor, he really paid for it. Now the other fellow has to pay for his. How, quote unquote, by making a mashicha, and he didn't make the mashicha, the animal died, there was no transaction. That's why the Gemara says, no deal, everybody has to give back everything else. So, Michael, what you have to think about here is you have to transpose the money for the animal, even though money is not in the picture, merely because he asked, how much is it worth? That trigger word triggers a monetary transaction, not a chalipin. That's the chiddush of this Gemara. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I have a problem with it because you're trying to establish an exchange.
Right.
So, as you said, from what we've heard previously, to execute a chalifin, you do not need to have equal value. If the parties agree to it, the parties agree to it, and it doesn't matter. So
Correct.
If you're saying, well, I don't think a cow is worth a donkey, so I want to know what you think each is, so I can add something to the chalifin, that is not in and of itself a monetary transaction, so it's not a purchase. But you're saying once how you measure value is in a monetary way.
Right.
When there's a currency. So asking that question, or trying to figure out what equal value is a common way to do that. Does not indicate a purchase. It could in and of itself.
I hear what you're saying. The Gemara begs to differ, and the Gemara.
So is
wants
that the
to
halacha,
establish
Rabbi? Is it anytime you mention money,
money.
the halacha is that it's a purchase, regardless of whether it is or not?
Yes, that's the Shema Mina. That's what the Gemara concludes and says. When you start talking about money in a transaction that is otherwise looks like a chalipin, you have taken it out of the Torah of chalipin and put it into the Torah, into the parsha, so to speak, of money. That's the chiddush of this Gemara. I wouldn't have known that. I would not have known that, because they still want to make the money never appeared here, Michael. There was no money that ever came into the picture, but the mere mention of money means that I'm makbid. I'm particular how much it's worth. Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked.
Well, let me ask a question, Rabbi, to follow up on this. So if I'm in livestock exchange and I say I want to exchange 3 hens for 6 doves, let's just say.
Yeah.
And if I'm trying to equate the value in an industry that equates value, I'm not necessarily executing a purchase. I may be executing a swap. So if they mention money, the value in monetary terms, then it's a problem. But if they mention the value in terms of 6, in my example, which doesn't make any sense, 3 hens equals 6 doves, then it's not a monetary transaction.
Right. So I'm going to give you credit, Michael, and I'm going to say that your question is really the question of the Gemara. What you just asked, because it doesn't make sense to you, and I understand that. Why should it take it from the Torah of Chalipin to the Torah of money? Because I mentioned money. Why? So let's pause a minute. Let me read the next Gemara and tell me if that isn't what the Gemara is asking. Okay, so now we just said, what did we just say? We just said Shema Mina Chalipin or Makbid Aleim Lo Kana. That if there's Chalipin and he's Makbid because he asked about money, he's not Kana. Right? That's what we just said. And then you asked your question. Now look at the next line. Omar Rava, says Rava, Otu Chalipin Beshufteni Askinan the Lokopte. Are we talking about Chalipin where nobody is concerned for the price? In other words, are they just so bland? Are they so not tuned in that price is not a factor in this whole thing? In other words, inherent, like you just said, inherent in the discussion of Chalipin, price is on everybody's mind. How could you say it's not? That's what the Rav is saying. Are we really saying, you want to tell me that the minute money is mentioned, it changes it from Chalipin to purchase? Are we talking about such bland or such plain individuals that they're not thinking about valuation? Of course they are. Says the Gemara, Ela kol Chalipin mikde kopte v'kana. Every case of Chalipin has to have valuations in it. Then your question is a valid question. If it has valuations in it, why is it not Chalipin? Why do you say it's a purchase? Inherent in a Chalipin is the discussion of money, even if you don't raise money. There is a monetary component to this Chalipin in your mind and in my mind. That's the Gemara's question. Elomai v'hocha b'may askinan. So the Gemara has to give now a different answer from what we just said before, where they exchanged a donkey for chamor, a donkey for a para. Now listen to this. V'hocha b'may askinan de'omale chamor where b'para v'teleh. I have a chamor and I want to trade it to you, but I want you to give me a cow, a kapara, and a teleh, and a sheep. In other words, I want 2 things from you, not just a cow. I want a cow and a sheep. The lo havale meshicha ma'alya, and you didn't give me the sheep. In other words, the scenario is as follows. You and I meet in the marketplace. I say to you, what are you doing? I said, I've got a cow and I want to exchange it. He says, I have a chamor. But for my chamor, I want your cow and also throw in a sheep on top of it. And the fella says, okay, I'll give you a cow and a sheep. Now what happened? He gave him the chamor. He gave him the para, but he didn't give him the sheep. Now the chamor dies. Is there a transaction? I gave you the chamor. I gave you the cow. You're giving me the chamor, but you didn't give me what I bargained for. You didn't give me the para and the teleh, and now the chamor dies. Is there a transaction?
Was there a transaction?
It says that what?
It should be, was there a transaction?
In other words, the question is the transaction complete?
Yeah.
The transaction is not complete because even though one fellow made a meshicha on the chamor, which means that normally if there's chalipin, then that should end the transaction because he took the chamor, but the other fellow never got the teleh.
But he can't end the transaction without the sheep.
That's why when the chamor dies, says the Gemara, there is no transaction. Everything goes back. It's chalipin, and in chalipin, the first person who makes the meshicha seals the deal. Says the Gemara, yes, he seals it.
It's not all there. There can't be chalipin even.
Why can't there be chalipin? Because
the sheep wasn't part of the deal yet.
That's correct. That's the Gemara's answer. The Gemara says our situation is not a chamor for a para. You're right. If it's a chamor for a para, Michael and Jay, then the deal is done. Once the fellow takes it, then the chamor dies. Tough luck. But the deal never sealed. The deal never sealed because
if you had a deal of two of each one, two chamor and
right.
two cows, and only one of them was pulled meshicha, how can it ever be a completed deal? You didn't finish the basic transaction. Not 1 for 1, 2 for 2.
Right. Okay. So that's the Gemara's teretz here by saying you're right. If it's simply a trade of 1 for 1,
that's what I'm saying.
And one person made the kinyan, it's a done deal, even if the animal dies before the second guy has a chance to make. But the answer is that's not our scenario, says the Gemara. Our scenario was that they came into the shuk, and here's what happened. One guy had a chamor, one guy had a para. They wanted to make a trade. The Bala Chamor says, I can't take equal value because it's not equal value, so I want a teleh. And he says, fine, I'll give you a teleh. So he gave him the para, but not the teleh, and then the animal died. So now the Gemara is analyzing for us that since the transaction was not complete, exactly what you said, therefore, the first meshicha can't be considered chalipin to end the transaction right there. There has to be a completion, at least of the other side, because the guy didn't give him a teleh. There was never a teleh in the picture. He only gave him a para, not a teleh. So now, Michael, to your question, now your question should be answered, because in your scenario, you're saying that the deal should be done if it's a chamor for a para. Says the Gemara, it is done. You're right. It's chalipin because the deal was done. But he's saying that the facts on the ground were different than what we thought they were. And because they're different, we have to analyze it differently. And therefore, like you just said, Michael, in your scenario, said there was something else that had to be thrown in. That's what the Gemara is saying. There has something else that has to be thrown in here, meaning the teleh, the sheep. And since the sheep was not exchanged, the first part of the deal never happened. That's the Gemara's answer. So let's look at Rashi for a minute. Understand? Paras chalama haba b'shuk. Amarava amachalipin dekra b'shuftini askinan. Are we talking of the lokopta ladas she'eshavas ktsas damim she'ita ve'enav loseslo shalo kenegdo? Are we saying that people are so disinterested in valuation that they don't care if the deal is so one-sided and it's not equal? So he says, no, of course not. People do have valuations in mind, even if they do not articulate them, because no one wants to be taken for a sucker. You're going to give me a chamar for $100. I'm going to give you a par for $1,000. I'm not doing that. Of course, I'm not doing it. So the Gemara is imputing that when people come into the marketplace, they at least have some knowledge of what their animal is worth. Again, the Gemara is imputing that and saying that people don't come into the marketplace bereft of any knowledge of what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. I know that I want a cow, and I'll trade it for a chamor. I know a chamor is approximately worth 100, and my cow is also worth 100. I'm willing to do that exchange. Doesn't matter if it's 105 versus 100, 110 versus 100. I don't care, right? As long as it's not 150 or something that's beyond the chomesh. A chomesh is a sixth, whatever that comes out to be, 12%. Okay, but so that's how the Gemara looks at it.
Rabbi, can I just ask a clarifying
Sure,
question?
go ahead.
Going back to Rav Ada bar Ahava, he said that once you ask about value, and you said that that's the halacha shma mina. So once they ask about value, the transaction, it's not a chalifin, it's off. That's what we said. It's a sale. Even if he had completed, it wouldn't have been an exchange. It would have been a sale, and to consummate the sale, it's different than a chalifin. So
why do you say that? Why do you say that that it would be a sale if I'm going to exchange a chamor for a para and a taleh?
Because it's how you execute the transaction is different.
What is that? I'm not sure. What
You're
does
not.
That mean?
You're. I mean, in chalifin, don't you just have to move the? No, it's a sale that you have to move the animal, right?
In a sale, you have to move the animal other than the money. In
a chalifin, you have to have an exchange.
A kinyan.
So we haven't heard anything about a kinyan here, but implicitly there was a kinyan when this was taken care of, because it doesn't talk about that in the Gemara as to how the transaction was effectuated. So, and if it was a kinyan, then as soon as he asked about the value in monetary terms, then it called off the kinyan. So it had to be a sale.
Okay, so I'm not sure what you're driving at. Let me say something in a different way. Maybe this will let you understand. If you and I come into the marketplace, you're pulling a chamor, I'm pulling a shor. No money is discussed. There's no money that's put on the table, and I say to you, I want to. You need a chamor. I'll give you a chamor. You have a para here. I need a taleh. I don't see one here. You don't have one here right now, but I need a taleh. I need a sheep. And the fellow says, fine, but there's no sheep to be observed. There's no sheep to be found. Now, in a case of chalipin, if I normally, you come and make a kinyan on one part of the item, then the other part automatically becomes acquired. And we don't have to make, let me just finish, and you don't have to make a separate kinyan. But if a deal is a chamor for a shor or a para and a taleh, and the taleh is nowhere to be found, then the fact that I make a kinyan on the one animal can't trigger a chalipin for the other animal, because there is another animal involved and it's not here.
But wait a second. I thought if the first party to move it, so if the para seller moves it, even though the taleh is not there, it's still a transaction. It provide it later.
It can't be a transaction, because the para and the taleh were one object. It's two animals.
I'm sorry. I said it wrong. The chamor made the kinyan. The chamor moved the chamor to make.
No, he didn't move. No, the first person to move was the person who was taking the para. In this scenario of the Gemara, the first person to make a kinyan was the fellow who was acquiring the para and the taleh.
Right, and so he made the transaction.
He only made a transaction on the para, not the taleh, because the taleh wasn't here right now.
But I thought that you could provide that later if there was a kinyan.
No, if my deal with you, Michael, is you give me a para and a taleh, and I'll give you a chamor.
2 for 1.
2 for 1.
Right.
Then in order for the transaction to be completed by the person pulling the para, he's got to pull both animals. Once he pulls both animals, the chamor automatically belongs to the other guy, and if it dies, tough luck.
Wait,
because the first person made the kinyan.
I obviously misunderstood something. I thought
Right.
either party could make the kinyan.
That's right.
And
But
so if the chamor made the pull first,
you're right. Then it would be a kinyan, but that's not what happened here.
that's
You're
not
right.
what happened. Okay.
What happened
I
is
misunderstood.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No, if the Baal Chamor did it first, you're right, then it's a deal. But if the guy acquiring the para and the Taleh made the Mashiach, but he made the Mashiach only on the para, but not on the Taleh, then the
Yeah,
Chamor
that I
never
understand.
became the other guy's animal, and then the animal died. No deal.
Excuse
I
me,
misunderstood.
Rabbi.
I thought it said in either case. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Right, but
Excuse me, Rabbi.
he would have had to have pulled both animals to trigger a completed deal. If he didn't pull both animals, then when the other guy pulled the chamor, or he's about to pull the chamor and it died, there was never he was making the first kinyan, because the other guy who pulled the para didn't complete a kinyan because he didn't have a taleh. So his kinyan was only half a kinyan. So now if the chamor guy pulls the chamor, it's a kinyan, but the chamor died. If the chamor died, there's no kinyan.
Yeah, excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Aren't we missing a conversation here?
What is?
Doesn't each party have to ask something about the condition of the poor or the cow or two people that trade
Jay, the two healthy animals sitting in the thing, and one animal dies suddenly. I mean, the owner of the chamor could never have known that his animal had a heart attack. How would he know?
How does each one know before they go further?
Okay.
Why aren't they asking about the condition?
You know what? I'll give you this. If that transaction had completed, let's say it had completed, right? He pulled the taleh, and then the chamor died, and then the guy who's taking the chamor says, "My animal just died. Did you know?" And he says, "No, I didn't know." And then he makes an inquiry and finds out that this chamor has been suffering for the last 60 days. And it was, in other words, if he does an inquiry and finds out that the animal was in fact not healthy, then he can undo the transaction. But that's not what we're talking about.
No,
we're talking about an animal died suddenly. Animal died suddenly.
I'm not asking it that way.
Yeah.
Isn't part of the initial discussion.
And they never asked. You're right. They never asked, "Do you have a healthy animal?"
Don't you assume people are going to ask the condition of the other person's object, whatever it is? I mean, before you start talking,
isn't the presumption though they're in person with both animals, and so they look it over at that point? I mean,
I'm just saying that
buyer's risk. I mean,
but you know something? I'll give you that. I'll give you that each one looked at the other animal and they looked pretty good. They looked pretty healthy. But when he was about to take it, it died.
But you see, the thing is that words matter. That's what we just finished discussing.
Right.
It kicks into a sale or a halipman. So don't you have to assume that they both question the condition?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Now,
Jay, I give you that. Let's assume they did. So what?
When you both of them ask condition,
right?
That have any effect on whether it's going to be a sale or a
No. Asking that question will not have an effect. And let's assume for our discussion that they asked, "Is your cow healthy?" Yes. "Is your chamor healthy?" Yes. They asked the question. Has nothing to do with chalipin or sale. Nothing. Now they made the transaction, and the chamor goes and dies.
Something else. Yeah, I understand.
Chamor goes and dies. But so let's assume they did ask. Okay, they were smart enough to ask, "Is your cow healthy?" Yes. "Is your chamor healthy?" Yes. Again, the point right now is everything was done right, but it was a 2-for-1. And because it was a 2-for-1, the Gemara is telling us that if you only made a kinyan on the one, not the second, that kinyan was never completed. So if you then have a chamor that dies, then there's no kinyan because the chalipin never.
My concern was that the minute you start asking conditions,
you change it. No,
isn't that equivalent to asking for the price of that?
Right. No. Doesn't that make you makpid in and of itself if you're checking the teeth and blah?
It makes it makpid, but that has nothing to do with chalipin versus sale, because both in a chalipin and in a sale, you can always ask, "How is your cow healthy? Is your donkey healthy?" as long as we're not talking money. The key here is money, not the extraneous questions. How you doing? How's the animal? Is it okay? Does it have enough to eat? But those are all extraneous questions. The key question is valuation. And the Gemara is trying to tell us that once you start talking about valuation, you're changing the nature of the transaction from chalipin to damin. Otherwise, why would you ask? In other words, now we saw earlier that even in the case of pure chalipin, asking a question can trigger ona'ah, right? The monetary value. And the Gemara wants to tell us it triggers the ona'ah, but doesn't change the nature of the transaction.
That's a chiddush right away.
That's a chiddush. I agree with you, which is why the second manda Amar of Abba Amar Rava Amar Rav Huna says that there is no ona'ah, because he recognized that if you say there's ona'ah, that may cloud the transaction. You're absolutely right. That's why he came and he argued on Rabbah and he said, Rabbah, I don't like what you're saying that there's ona'ah here, because then it's a contradiction in terms. You're telling me it's a chalipin, but you're also telling me that money has something to do with it. I don't like that. That's why there's a machlokes here between Rabbah and Rav Abba as to whether or not there is ona'ah. But having put that question aside for a minute, they both agreed, each in his own way, that the transaction happened. The only question was, does it trigger ona'ah? But now, when there was a clear discussion of valuation, the Gemara says, no, that I can't countenance. I can't countenance that we're going to make a transaction, but you're going to ask about values, and it's still chalipin. That I can't deal with. So the Gemara wants to conclude, therefore, as we stand now, there is no proof again that money can make chalipin, because when you start talking about money, even sort of as an aside, you've taken it out of chalipin into money. Therefore, there's no proof that money can actuate chalipin. So we're back to the same question that we had all along. Can money act in chalipin? The answer is, for this Gemara, it seems it cannot, because once you introduce money into the picture, then you can no longer think. Okay, so that's where we are. So Mitchum, next week we'll again, I don't know what we're going to finalize, but we're going to pick it up from Omar, because again, the Gemara now is going to try to understand, back to the question, can we still find a sort of hook to hang our hat on, that money, even though it's monetary, can still make chalipin? Gemara has not given up on that position, and the Gemara is going to ask it one more time. So Mitchell, next week we'll start from Omar. But with the chiddush today, we learned a tremendous chiddush, because as we advance in this Gemara, we're finding every time a new scenario that gives us at least pause to think that maybe money can be used for chalipin, as we did today. Comes the Gemara and says, no, you might think that it can be used for chalipin. I'm going to show you that it can't be used for chalipin. So again, this is an ongoing discussion that the Gemara is bent on trying to find a way, and we're going to find, at the end of the day, we're going to find an ultimate conclusion. But in each and every scenario, we raise the question and then we thwart it. Raise the question and thwart it. So once again, we thwarted it by saying that you can't have chalipin when money is even in the discussion, even if money never appeared on the scene, but they just talked about it. That's enough to queer the chalipin and make it a monetary transaction. Again, another chiddush. All right, so Mitzvah Shem will pick it up next week, and yeah.
Yeshikoach.